Hi ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Casper Chess, where we force people to subscribe because of our great content. Anyway, in this video, I want to show you one great defense strategy that you can try against many openings. I mean, literally everything that white plays. And we're going to start with the queen's pawn opening. Then I'm going to conclude with the king's pawn opening. So this would just be a quick repertoire for black players who still struggle with what to do against these two famous openings. So after pawn to d4, the move that I recommend is knight f6 right away. And what do we see in the latest database? Pawn to c4 is the top played move. So maybe white is trying to set up a queen's gambit structure, even though this is the Indian defense. Here is the first surprise that you can try out, knight c6. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is called the Mexican defense, which you can also highly depend on in OTB classical tournaments. So there are three common moves that you are going to see in this position. Number one, knight c3. Number two, knight to f3. And number three, pawn to d5. So let's begin with knight c3. Now here is the power of the Mexican defense, guys. The whole idea is to go back to the e4, e5 lines. Because after you play e5, the top played move that you are going to see, whether on lichess or in real life, as in the Masters database, is pawn to d5. Because d4 players want to keep the position closed in the opening stage. And this is our dream, because now we want to relocate our queen's knight to the king's side, beginning with the move knight e7. e4 is mostly played, after which you go knight g6. And this is one of our goals in the opening stage. We want to plant one of our knights on f4, which is the juicy square. Given a chance, our f knight should sit on f4 someday, or depending on the position, our g knight can also sit on f4 to control all these highlighted squares in red. So bishop d3 may be played, after which you now think of developing your dark squared bishop because you now want to put your king to safety, right? So bishop b4 makes a lot of sense because it's an attacking move, forcing white to make a decision. But if white plays the top played move knight ge2, this is when you can castle short. First of all, I would love to point out one common blunder that black players make in this position, pawn to d6. Never think of playing pawn to d6 before you castle short in the Mexican defense, just to keep everything simple. Because you don't have a knight on c6, white can easily play queen a4 check, which also wins your dark squared bishop. So this is just one point to jot down. Alternatively, I propose getting rid of your dark squared bishop right away before playing pawn to d6. So you can just castle short, and after pawn to a3, bishop c5 is okay, but I like playing simple chess, just simplifying the game. And now this is when I play pawn to d6, trying to lock the center so that I can start attacking on the sides. The beauty of the Mexican defense is that you try to force white to play on your terms. You don't want to enter into their queen's gambit prep or their queen's pawn game. Another line may go as follows, where you go pawn to e5 again. If pawn to d5, you do the needful by putting your knight on g6. Now after playing knight g6 and white plays bishop d3, you still go bishop b4, pinning that knight. If they don't attend to this threat, by playing knight e2 and instead go knight to f3 or something else, you can just mess up white's pawn structure and lock the center to stop pawn to c5 next. b6 is also coming, and pawn to f5 to close down the position. If castle short is played, you simply castle short as well. Whenever bishop g5 comes, you chase that bishop away. See, they can't even play bishop h4 because we're just going to take. If bishop e3, remember c5 may be a possibility because of this support system. So that's why you want to go b6, and if f4 is played, just go pawn to f5, and the game from the queen side has ended. There are no any meaningful pawn movements that white can make. So now the concentration will be on the king side, and now it will be easier for you to play your e4, e5 stuff. For example, after pawn to h3, the next thing you want to do is to put one of your knights on f4. This is called the juicy f4 square, and if you can manage to plant one of your knights here, you will win 80% of your games. For example, instead of knight to f4, even though that is also playable, we prefer putting the g knight on f4. There is no knight takes e5 by the way due to knight takes e5, and if queen takes h5, white will be down a piece. Now after the first 3 moves of the game, in the knight c3 line, what if white takes your e5 pawn instead of going pawn to d5? Let's say d takes e5 this time. Well, you can just take back, and now it is clear that your battle will be on the queen side, since this is where majority of your pawns are. Pawn to e4, you want to castle short right, you go bishop b4 given a chance, because you want to mess up white's pawn structure on the queen side. They better play bishop d2 or knight e2, but this is when you can castle short after pawn to a3. Simplifying the game is the way to go, and now you play rook e8, developing your rook in a defensive way, which is good. If pawn to f4, knight g6 is okay. Now 2 of white's pawns are under attack. If pawn to e5, since this pawn is pinned, you can even play pawn to d6 here to neutralize this attack. Let's say knight f3, you simply go knight e4, attacking this bishop and also this pawn, and literally everything. In this position, Stockfish gives a winning advantage to black due to a positional advantage. Anyway, so back to our Mexican defense initial position. Because of the possibility of pawn to e5 in the knight c3 line, white players are now starting with knight to f3 to stop this, and also just to avoid going back to the king's pawn lines. But you know what? You can still go pawn to e5 anyways, and this is also played at the top level. You can check in the master's database. With pawn to e5, you are now okay to transpose the game back to the Budapest defense. E.g. after de, you go knight g4. This is what you do in the Budapest. They usually play bishop f4, and now you go bishop b4 check. If knight bd2, this is where you play queen e7. Remember, if they play pawn to a3, this is where you demonstrate the famous Budapest trap, where you hang your dark squared bishop on b4 deliberately so that if white takes, you now deliver this beautiful smoothed checkmate. And allow me to say the Budapest defense is not a dubious opening for black as many people think, cause there are so many ways in which you can get back this pawn on e5. If anything, you're just trying to avoid the queen's pawn lines by shifting the attention to this e5 pawn. So even if white doesn't fall for this beginner's trap, after queen e7, let's say they play pawn to e3, in serious classical games, you can just take back your pawn, and now material is equal. After knight takes, you take back with your other knight, and after something like bishop e2, intending to castle short, you can simply castle short as well, or maybe come up with any meaningful strategy like pawn to b6, bishop b7 to control this diagonal, etc. If pawn to a3, the best is just to get rid of that knight. After queen takes, now you go pawn to d6 and leave your knight on e5 forever. It would take white to trade off his dark squared bishop to get rid of your active knight, which is controlling all these highlighted squares on the board, including this one. Or at worst, white will be forced to damage his pawn structure. Anyway, if you don't want to go this route, after white plays pawn to e3, instead of taking back, you can also try the following Gambit line, which leads to a nasty trap, beginning with a move pawn to f6. If pawn takes happens, you now take back with your queen, attacking the b2 pawn. Let's say rook b1 is played. Now you test the waters by playing bishop c5. It looks like you're doing nothing. If white carelessly plays pawn to h3, now you can surprise them with a move knight takes f2, double attacking the rook and the queen on d1. So king takes is forced, after which you now take the free bishop on f4, taking advantage of this pinned pawn by your bishop. And next you have all sorts of tactics, including castle short. How cool is that? So this is very much playable in rapid, blitz, and bullet. Should now feel very comfortable playing the Mexican defense. Now one may ask, what if white plays pawn to d5 right away instead of knight c3 or knight to f3? Well, this is the simplest of all, because now it is easy for you to relocate your queen's knight to the king side. But hold on, there is one little trap that white prepares in this line, beginning with a move pawn to e4. Here it looks like this is just a free pawn, but if you exercise a bit of patience, you will see that after knight takes, you're going to lose one of your knights when white plays knight d4. That's why there is no such a thing as a free lunch in chess, especially if you are playing against a stronger opponent. So just ignore that pawn and go pawn to e6, paving way for your dark squared bishop and also intending to capture on d5 given a chance, because if pawn to f4, by the way, you don't have any weaknesses. If de happens, you capture with your f pawn to avoid an early queen trade. Or first of all, go bishop b4 check to try and mess up white's pawn structure if knight c3, and if bishop d2, you get rid of that bishop. And knight takes, and now because white's knight is sitting in front of the queen, your woman try taking with your d pawn instead of your f pawn. And in this position, black is doing great. First of all, these pawns are overextended and there are so many weaknesses that white has created for himself. You know what? Even against pawn to e4, you can try to play in the Mexican defense style, beginning with the move knight c6, which is the Nimzowitsch defense. If pawn to d4, you simply go pawn to e5, and as you can see, the top played move in the Lichess database is pawn to d5, after which you simply go knight c e7, simple stuff. They play pawn to c4, trying to gain some more central space. You go knight g6, paving way for your dark squared bishop. After knight c3, you develop your dark squared bishop as usual, but remember not to play pawn to d6 due to queen a4 check and you might lose your bishop. Anyways, white may play bishop d3, after which you go takes, messing up white's pawn structure. And now that you've gotten rid of your bishop, now this is when you go pawn to d6, stopping pawn to c5. Let's say knight to f3, you simply go knight to f6. Again, see these Mexican knights fighting for the f4 square in the near future. Castle shot may be played. You can do the same if you want to. If bishop g5, you know what to do. Again, if bishop e3, you know that you want to play c5, so you go pawn to b6. If pawn to a4, once again you lock the queen side completely, just like what you do in the Mexican defense. Afraid of bishop g4, white usually plays pawn to h3, but this is when you can think of planting one of your knights on f4. Even knight f4 directly is okay, since you are getting rid of white's bishop pair, and that'll be fine. But because the light squared bishop has no defender, we always want to put the f knight on f4. And this is the trap that we saw in the Mexican defense, where this can happen, after which you take back, because after queen takes h5, you're going to be up a piece. Same stuff, same mistake. If that doesn't happen, after e4, knight c6, d4, and pawn to e5, and let's say white plays knight to f3 instead of pawn to d5, this is now transposed into the Scotch game, and you should know what to do. I have several videos on how you can take down the Scotch game, but just to show you quickly, you can just take on d4. Knight takes is the Scotch game, but bishop c4 is the Scotch Gambit. And so the only thing that you need to know in the Scotch Gambit is to put your dark squared bishop on b6 and your queen on f6, while your king's knight should sit on e7. Done. For example, bishop b4 first, after c3, you take the pawn, and let's say bc, you now go bishop a5. For example, after castle shot, you play bishop b6, pinning the f pawn in advance. How do you develop your queen? You put it on f6, and your king's knight on e7. If bishop g5 is played, you don't have this time, so better go on knight g e7. This is okay. You just avoided tons of traps in the Scotch Gambit. If knight bd2 is played, you simply go castle shot, knight b3, pawn to d6, you pave way for your light squared bishop. If h3 is played, you go pawn to h6, bishop h4, queen e8, you unpin your knight. Now your knight will sit on g6, over controlling the e5 square with your other knight on c6. And maybe someday sit on f4. So this is how you fight the Scotch Gambit professionally. In case white plays the Scotch game instead of the Scotch Gambit, the best line that I recommend is the bishop c5 line, where you let them take your knight and then you don't take back immediately. You first of all develop your queen in a way of threatening checkmate in one and also counterattacking that knight. If queen d2 is played, that's when you can simply take that knight, develop your bishop, and castle long. Your king's knight will sit on e7. Instead of queen d2, if white plays queen f3, there are so many things that you can do, but out of everything, I love this line, just to simplify everything and castle long in the long run. I don't mind playing like this. If bishop c4 is played, I just go knight to f6. If bishop g5 is played, I can play knight h5 and castle short in peace if I want to. This can be anyone's game with perfect play. Last line, after pawn to e4. Speaking of the Mexican defense structure, you still want to start with knight c6. Now what if white doesn't play pawn to d4 immediately, but let's say they go knight to f3? Well, the simplest is to go pawn to e5, right? Maybe you might run into the Scotch game once again, but the Mexican move I wanted to show you is still knight to f6. This has also been played at the top level, also trusted by Levon. The whole idea is to play this in the Ali Hines style, beginning with knight d5. If pawn to c4 is played, you simply go knight b6. So this is like the improved Ali Hines defense with your knight on c6. c5 is never a good move due to knight d5. That would be a great outpost for this knight. If pawn to d4, the best is to play pawn to d6, threatening to take and win the queen. So white usually takes, after which you take back. And if knight c3, this is when you go pawn to e5, same stuff. They usually play pawn to d5, but if pawn takes, you can now go bishop e6, targeting this pawn twice, which is only defended by white's light squared bishop. If pawn to b3 is played, now you play d takes e5, knowing that if queen takes, you can take back with the rook and be ahead in development. So at the end of the day, this idea of opening up with your two knights either against d4 or against e4 can work pretty much well against most unprepared opponents. If you'd love to learn more about this opening prep, simply follow me on Patreon through the link in the comment section down below. For now, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. You can also check out my courses at www.kasperchess.com if you want to learn more things. But for now, thank you for your support. Until next time, bye bye.